Dr. Smith. Maybe a couple of seconds and I will.
Hi, I'm Selwyn Manning and you are watching A View from Afar, and as always we are joined today by political scientist and former Pentagon analyst Paul Buchanan, and this week we will discuss how security, defence and trade deals do not always go hand in hand, and specifically we will discuss on security. China is alone in the Western Pacific as the United States, India, Australia and other ASEAN nations take part in naval security exercises in the Arabian Sea. And on trade, we will talk about China has signed up to the RCEP, or Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and as have most of the ASEAN states, plus Japan, Australia, New Zealand. But India rejected the deal back in late 2019. We'll also talk about multilateralism, and we will consider whether or not the BRICS states, or the BRIC blocs if you like, is it dead in the water. But first, here's an invitation to those of you who are joining us live. If you are joining us via Facebook, Twitter or YouTube, feel free to make comments, and if you do, we'll be able to include your interaction in this program. So let's cross to Paul, who is waiting online. Good afternoon, Paul.
Kia ora, Selwyn, and my apologies for not meeting up with you last week. As the French say, there was a force majeure at work there, and so well, again, it's good to be back.
Well, tēnā koe, kia ora, good health to you, and it's good to see you back fighting fit, Paul. So,
it's always a pleasure.
First off the blocks, we're talking about the security or insecurity perhaps, or the security blocks that are taking shape in the Western Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific region as some like to actually put it. Paul, can you talk us through this and put it into a perspective of where perhaps we were a couple of months ago and what the differences are now?
Yeah, you know, it's been an interesting series of developments. I think that, and it's good today we're not going to focus on the U.S. after, you know, a lot of talk about the elections, but we can't avoid at least mentioning the U.S. and what's apparently happening, perhaps because of the unreliability of the Trump administration, perhaps because people around the world are realizing that the United States is not quite the superpower that it used to be. It cannot, you know, it can no longer go around putting out fires all over the world unilaterally. But whatever the reason, we're seeing the emergence of military alliances that in some cases involve the United States, in other cases they don't, but in all cases they appear to be anti-China defensive alliances, particularly in the maritime realm. And this includes, for example, the ASEAN countries. The ASEAN countries, that's the Southeast Asian rim, if you will, Normally the approach to ASEAN was that they were a paper tiger, that they spend too much time quarreling amongst themselves. They don't trust each other enough to engage in ongoing military exercises, but now they are. And the single common denominator in both bilateral and multilateral exercises within the ASEAN states is the fact that they're all deathly afraid of Chinese encroachment on their respective national territories. So we see that in the South China Sea. Again, the tempo of exercises is increased. The U.S. sometimes is involved, but sometimes it's not. New Zealand and Australia sometimes are involved. But ASEAN has picked up the pace in the military realm. And then, of course, we have new alliance structures, such as the so-called Quad, a military alliance in the making that involves Japan, India, Australia, and the United States. They've just completed exercises in the Indian Ocean. They're now, right now, in the North Arabian Sea. And even though the China is not mentioned, it is very clear from the nature of those exercises that all of this is directed at interdicting and countering Chinese maritime power projection in its far abroad. So
let's have a look.
Go ahead.
Yeah, let's have a look at this. What you're talking about here. Here's a
Malabar exercise, the Indian Navy's
piece from the Times
carrier battle group,
in
the
India.
Nimitz strike group of the US Navy, and several frontline warships from the Australian and Japanese navies will carry out a 4-day high-intensity war game in the northern Arabian Sea from today. The exercise comes as a stern message to China that is not to be missed. And Srinjoy continues to be with me on the broadcast. Srinjoy, how do we connect this naval exercise in the Arabian Sea with the BRICS summit? Is it possible that China may raise a voice or some sort of concern related to this?
Well, not in the BRICS summit, perhaps. China may speak separately about it. It's not happy at all about the Quad.
So what they're starting to talk about there, Paul, is exactly what you've raised here, that there's concerns, particularly amongst those countries, those states, those economies that are forming pacts together in various different arrangements against where China asserting its interests, should we put it that way, in the region. This exercise is going on right now. Also, as I understand it, amongst the Quad members, that this is the first time in over a decade that Australia has actually taken part in a naval exercise with this Quad in this group.
Exactly. Exactly.
And so this is obviously significant at a time of which in previous episodes you have identified unease, to say the least, amongst ASEAN nations, but particularly with India, Japan to a degree, and what we're seeing here is the Australians joining in that chorus of concern, if you like. So where do you see the significance going forward, that awful term, but going forward from here?
Oh, well, I think that one of the major developments is that countries are no longer looking first to the United States for security guarantees. I mean, the fact is that they're now looking to each other. We're starting to see security alliances that are not, the old Anglophone or pro-West versus East type of security alliances. I mean, these are now, mixed bags of Asian countries with Western countries, Central Asian countries, South Asian countries. I happen to think that's a salutary development, that you no longer have countries always looking to the United States as the savior of first recourse. But what's interesting is I think the precipitant to this is not just the aggression, if you will, or the very strong aggressive moves that China has made in the South China Sea. It's added to the fact that China now has naval bases in Pakistan, in the Gulf of Arabia, and more importantly, I think the takeover of Hong Kong has scared a lot of countries, particularly in Southeast Asia,
And that's
about
intensified over the last 7 days.
it has. In fact, I mean, I'll be honest with you. It's all over but the shouting. When the Democratic opposition bloc in the Hong Kong Parliament walked out after the arrest of several of its members, that's it. Democracy is dead in Hong Kong 25 years before the scheduled devolution date, and the West said nothing.
I was going to say that I didn't detect one word of concern coming from particularly the United Kingdom, and you would expect the UK, considering its historical involvement with Hong Kong, its deep-rooted interactions both diplomatically but also economically in the region via Hong Kong, and from the point of view that it was the one that was the part of the two-pronged deal with China when it handed Hong Kong back to China. What was that date then?
1999 was
1999. So this is really China asserting itself and saying, you know, we are asserting our one nation policy. Hong Kong is well and truly in our fold now.
Yes, and I mean it's you could say, well, the British couldn't do much about it anyway. But you know, there are sanctions mechanisms that could have been invoked. The United States has said virtually nothing on that score.
It may not have been in a position to do something hands-on, for example, but the power and the persuasiveness of its position would have been a welcome thing for many nations in the Southeast Asia region should it have voiced it. Yeah.
Yeah, but see, that shows you the fallacy of the America First policy. The United States is, you know, people don't expect the United States to put its diplomatic weight in the right direction, at least.
But the UK, I was referring to the
United Kingdom. Well, the UK as well. I mean, the UK as well. But what, you know, the good part, I guess, is that it's been a serious reality check on countries in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and beyond. And so they're looking to each other in greater measure. And that's to my mind, is a positive development. Now, you said something at the onset that's very important. Traditionally, security partners are also trade partners. The idea is you have symmetries of security and trade. And that's because of the trust that develops between security partners.
Self-interest.
Or vice versa. But you trade with your security partners and vice versa. Increasingly as of the 90s, there's been an uncoupling of security and trade relationships around the world. And what we're seeing now, again, in light of the American withdrawal from the world stage, is countries looking to each other to form security and trade pacts that A, are independent of each other, and B, don't involve the United States.
Well, this is exactly this point, isn't it, with the RCEP? And for example, let's just bring that up on screen so the audience can see what we're talking about here. So, you know, this particular position, this piece here is through the Asia Media Centre, which is backed by the Asia New Zealand Foundation, which is backed by New Zealand's Foreign Affairs and Trade. So that's the line of the chain of information flow, if you like. And of course, you know, just it would be right to point out that the official name is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or the RCEP. These things have got a mouthful. The countries here that have signed up, China's the big one on the block, and Japan, yeah, from the economics point of view. But these countries like Australia and New Zealand, if you looked at where we were aligning through 2019, New Zealand's Foreign Affairs and the Department of Foreign Affairs in Australia were really pushing the line that this was our gateway, this region's gateway to accessing the markets in India. Now, of course, as it gets near the end of last year, 2019, India indicated that it had problems with this particular document. And the problems, in a basic sense, were all along that it gives an opportunity for China to assert its economic export might on countries like India with very little that would prevent dumping of product and service on India itself from China in particular. So New Zealand and Australia were left with its major big win if this had India in it was gone. So what it's been left with is solidifying up a common kind of pattern, a legal framework, a regulative framework of engagement, and very much the digital services type of thing coming to the fore. So those seem to be what New Zealand Foreign Affairs and Australian Foreign Affairs are actually pushing as the benefits. But as you have pointed out, Paul, that these groupings here are quite different from the security relationships that are forming very strongly in the Western Pacific this week. For example, we just where are we? We just go across to this article here from The Conversation, and it's an brief academic piece, but it is highlighting where Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison is meeting in Japan, has met in Japan, Japan's new Prime Minister, and that they are talking defence relationships. And this is in the same breath as where the security defence exercises are taking place with India, etc., where the signing of the economic trade pact with these countries has taken place with China in the fold. And this illustrates concerns, this particular move where Scott Morrison's over in Japan on defence and China is the elephant in the room that is not going to be spoken of. So that seems to be all of what has been happening in the last 5 days, yeah?
Yes, and beyond. I mean, this is more evidence. This is a bilateral military agreement of countries looking to each other without the presence of the United States. And of course, they are partners with the United States. But again, it's more proof that of the uncoupling of trade and security relationships, and then the move towards developing relationships amongst the community of nations that are not U.S.-centric. And if you step back, I tend to think from an objective perspective, this is a good thing. Now, let me say something about the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership.
Yeah.
You may recall, I'm sorry, you definitely recall that the United States withdrew from something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Yeah.
That involved some of these very same nations. Now, after it withdrew, the so-called TPP, as it was called, was renamed, watered down, and has come into effect. It's just not the big economic bloc that it was supposed to be. But
it didn't have China and it didn't have the US. Yeah,
exactly. So it's a much smaller deal. But here, to my mind, here is one of the key differences between TPP in whatever version it is and RCEP. TPP, at the end of the day, again to use a trite phrase, was an investor protection agreement. That is to say, it was more concerned about after entry issues. For example, not getting sued for environmental problems and what have you.
Lack of sovereignty within each domestic economy. Yeah?
It had to do with copyright. It had to do with intellectual property. It wasn't about tariffs per se, import and export duties. It wasn't about that. It was about companies setting up shop in other countries with some degree of legal immunity for what they were doing. And see, that was considered to be a magnet for investment. If you got guarantees that you wouldn't be legally liable for certain activities that would be prohibited in your home country, then obviously capital would flow to those
It's an
places.
interesting part there because the RCEP, for example, it appears that one of the main planks of it is to actually recognise the economy of origin with respect to services or product. and the legal or regulatory requirements around that. So it's an area which I find quite interesting, and obviously a lot of digestion has to go in that area to see really what does that mean, because they're also saying, and I'm sure the diplomats will be able to answer this, but they're also saying that there is a uniform kind of structure of which countries within this structure, within this RCEP can operate, so there's an element of clarity that has come from it. But once again, we've got this conflict between trade interests, self-interest with respect to let's get on with business and get this 30% of the globe's GDP really humming in this particular Indo-Pacific and Western Pacific area. But on the other hand, we've got real concerns about the authoritarianism it being expressed by China, a weaker and withdrawn and isolationist United States, and that may change, but it will take some time, as you've pointed out in previous episodes, and a break to those multilateral blocs, of which self-interest perhaps was the glue that held them together 10 years ago, and I'm talking about the BRICS. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So it's a complete different tapestry, isn't it?
It is. That's a very good way to phrase it. I'll just say one thing about RCEP. It involves the ASEAN countries. So again, that bloc, that Southeast Asian bloc, China, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, and South Korea. So it's a formidable bloc. You just mentioned it. It's 30 to 35% of the world's GDP. It's the biggest trade bloc in the world today. It's going to be phased in over 5 years, and most of it involves two things. One, the dropping of tariff barriers uniformly throughout the trade bloc, and two, the standardization of various bilateral trade agreements and whatnot. So everybody's playing off the same sheet of music. Now, it is clear, given that China is involved, that this is completely divorced from the security relationships of pretty much everybody else.
So now it's not just Australia and New Zealand that are striding the differences between trade and defence, whereas traditionally you can see, Australia and New Zealand very close to the United States in some respects relating to defence and security and intelligence in particular with respect to New Zealand. And then their trade and economic interests, of which are locked in Southeast Asia, but through necessity with China. And
yeah, I mean, it could be. Go ahead.
Yeah, and it's something that you wrote about a good 10 years ago, that at what point do those two pillars stress to the point where the fabric breaks down? So this, with having China involved in the RCEP and also estranged from the security, defence, intelligence pacts that are operating in its region, do you see the problem of a spark point, a tipping point, or how will this evolve in the short and medium term from the point of view of political science?
Well, I think there's two things involved here, and I could be wrong, but you can check me if you think it's a little too outrageous. The first one is that I think that still, and amongst trade negotiators worldwide, there is this belief that if you engage China on trade, it's not just this huge market that you can take advantage of, but as the Chinese and Chinese capital flows out into various trade partners, the Chinese diplomatic and military approach to the international community will start to mellow or soften, because they've now got economic interests dispersed throughout the world, but particularly in and around the South China Sea, and then again beyond. And so I think there's still this abiding belief that you bring the Chinese in and trade, and somewhere down the road, they're going to mellow out. I happen to disagree with that view, but I think that's the view of a lot of trade negotiators, including those who inked the deal with regards to RCEP. However, it seems also equally apparent that the trade negotiations are siloed from the military security equation. I'm getting the distinct feeling that trade negotiators, let's say here in New Zealand or in Australia, are increasingly talking amongst themselves, but not talking to their counterparts in defense and in the intelligence community.
So they're working in a bipolar type of arrangements within their own state. Yeah?
Yeah, exactly. I think they're getting, as I said, increasingly siloed because the Australian and New Zealand security apparatuses, including their militaries, but also the apparatuses of Singapore, of Indonesia, I mean, again, of these other states, are increasingly anti-Chinese in orientation. Again, those military exercises are proof of that. They're focused against the Chinese.
So if you look at it from the point of view of economics and progress, domestic progress, China needs its supply line secured in the Indo-Pacific region. And every other country within that region does as well, for their own progress and self-interest. Is that the area which can spark problems with respect to not just security defence issues, but also degrade the function of these trade pacts, of which has only been signed a matter of days ago?
Well, certainly, if jostling for position, let's say in and around the Malaccan Straits, occurs between, the People's, the People's Liberation Navy plan? Yeah, the People's Liberation Army Navy. If the Chinese Navy and the navies of other countries start jostling for position because of the Chinese territorial claims made on the eastern side of the Malay Peninsula, then yes, that's going to inhibit trade in a great measure until these things are resolved. I think the trade crowd think, well, look if Chinese companies trying to get quicker, better access to world markets and the sea lanes of communication relocate to Singapore or relocate to Doha, courtesy of these trade agreements and subsequent agreements, then they're less likely to interfere with free navigation through these very important waterways. On the other hand, the military crowd are like, no, that's not what they're going to do. What they're going to do is eventually move in so that they become the guarantors of freedom of passage, and that will depend on who they like and they don't like, very much in the way that the United States is the gatekeeper to some of the most important choke points throughout the world.
Strait of Hormuz, for example, et cetera, et cetera. With this, how concerned do you feel the People's Republic of China would be seeing Australia, which, let's face it, has significant military naval hardware and Air Force hardware in the region, actually joining and shaking hands with Japan, which for historical reasons and diplomatic reasons is lighter than you would expect in the military hardware area? How concerned, just to back up there, how concerned do you think China is when seeing that kind of pact forming and being in agreement at a time where two prime ministers, at a time where no one is, apart from Mike Pompeo, is actually meeting the flesh, pressing the flesh, if you like, diplomatically?
Well, this is, from the Chinese perspective, what they're seeing is walls being built around them. It goes back to a time-honored adage in the international relations literature called the security dilemma. And what that basically means is you look over the border and your neighbor is arming himself, buying new weapons and what have you, and you don't know his intent, so you arm yourself because you're not sure what's going on. And then he sees you arming yourself and he starts building up even more. Well, now you've got an arms race. And at that point, miscalculation can be deadly. This is the problem here. We, sitting in the West, may say, well, if the Chinese just backed off a little bit, then we could all relax. But they're not backing off. They're pushing their advantage because the United States has been weakened. The Chinese, on the other hand, go, no, we are simply laying claim to what is ours. South China Sea, for them, is called their internal sea. They believe that their great power status allows them to treat the South China Sea the way the United States treats the Caribbean. And so they're like, we're not doing anything other than just claiming what is rightfully ours. And yet you guys are now all reacting with these defensive alignments and what have you. We're going to have to get even more aggressive to back you off. So we're increasingly seeing, we are in fact seeing arms races now in Southeast Asia in a way we haven't seen previously.
I've never seen Australia move with its own determination into this region from the point of view of security in such a forthright, front-stepping way. Usually, in parts of the Pacific, we see it brokering the United States' interests, but this is Australian interests, Australia fair, striding out there with Japan.
Well, they're defining their security interests, sort of the limits of their regional security barricades as north of Indonesia. I mean, the Australians want to be able to buffer the motherland as far abroad or at sea as possible. And so you can't blame, but again, this all feeds into a syndrome where everybody's looking at each other, a little strangely. And it's not a matter of right or wrong at this point. It's a matter of perception and misperception. And so, it's understandable that the Australians have a reason to try to join the Japanese in this de facto anti-Chinese military alliance. But then the question is, how will the Chinese respond to that? And, they may not back off. They may not, see it as a reason to soften their approach to what they think are legitimate territorial claims, regardless of what the international community says. Now, this gets to another point, and it was our third point today, which is what's going on with the BRICS.
Yeah.
And I say that because the BRICS, they may not be completely done as an emerging power bloc, but they're certainly in serious trouble. And let's just think of it this way. China remains as a great power. India has been very slow to assume that status, and that is part of the reason why India did not want to get involved with RCEP, because they fear that they don't have the economy of scale that would allow them to play defense against Chinese economic depredation. You were absolutely right when you mentioned it. The Chinese could flood India with goods, displacing Indian enterprise in dramatic fashion. So India had, beyond nationalism, is just not quite there to be a peer competitor with the Chinese in the same trade umbrella. And so that may be part of the calculus. India will be a great power. It's just a little slower off the mark, and so long as Modi continues with his Hindu nationalism, focusing on fostering internal divisions between the Hindu and Muslim populations of India, they're never going to be able to be as unified on the external front as the Chinese have been able to do by forcibly suppressing minority communities. Now, Brazil is nowhere to be seen. The B in BRICS has regressed since it was first mentioned as a potential great power, and the same is true for South Africa. So you're left with China, India on delay, and then the final one is Russia.
And it's got its own gig happening around the world. Yeah,
it does. Now, Russia, I mean, its military is on steroids compared to its economic capability. Let's remember, Russia's total economic output is equivalent to that of the state of Texas in the United States. It's not even the state of California, the state of Texas. So on an economic level, Russia is nowhere close to being a great power.
Is it under threat of exhausting itself to sustain
it?
Yeah.
It is. And then, of course, you have the domestic political situation. Putin's not going to be there forever. They say that one of the Achilles heels of authoritarian regimes is the question of succession. Usually you try to institutionalize it, make sure that the legacy is preserved via institutional means. Putin has no designated successor, nor for that matter, I might add, does President Xi in China. He's now become the president for life, and that's bound to have grated on other members of the CCP. But Russia essentially has a rising opposition that they're suppressing, they're repressing, but they're not going away. And it's now military committed, not only to Syria, and it has been very effective militarily in the Levant, and now further into the Middle East, because the Russians are now in Libya, and they're not going away from Libya anytime soon. And Russia is a military ally of Iran. And for all the bluster and talk in the United States in particular about Iran, there's one hard fact that American strategists understand. So long as China and Russia are military allies of the Iranians, they will protect them diplomatically and militarily. First, in the Security Council, where they'll veto anything that infringes on Iranian interests, and secondly, militarily. I mean, the Chinese may be a little slower than the Russians in coming to Iranian aid, but think of it this way. There's been talk in the last week that Trump was actually thinking of bombing Iranian nuclear installations.
And the US military brass indicated that that would be folly, pushes them aside and basically says it's not going to happen. And overnight, 7, 8, 9 hours ago, Mike Pompeo was up in Jerusalem, a trilateral meeting with the foreign minister of Bahrain, the prime minister of Israel, Netanyahu, where they're isolating and speaking about further isolating through whatever means is available to them, Iran. So they're definitely, is an area where you can see justification for concerns when you look at the erratic elements of the last 2 months of the Trump presidency. But you're saying the military will hold their breath, the United States military here, but that may not necessarily equate to the confidence in the window of opportunity for states like Israel, for example.
Right. I mean, I also think that the Russians, because of their expanding influence in the Middle East, that they have many cards to play when it comes to limiting U.S. options and boxing the U.S. in, vis-a-vis Iran in particular. And so, Pompeo's on a farewell tour. It's very unlikely that he can reach any firm agreements with anybody at this point. Now, he may set the stage for future negotiations on a number of issues.
But they'll look completely different to what he would wish for them to appear, yeah?
Right. And I think the Biden administration is going to have a very, very different approach to international affairs in the Middle East in particular. But, the issue simply is that the BRICS themselves aren't the power bloc that they were supposed to be. And what's happened, getting back to our larger issue about, the uncoupling of trade and security and the formation of these new economic and security blocs, is that we may see a lot of that incorporating former members of the BRICS. So you never know what constellation of actors will come out of that. I mean, again...
Is that where the solutions come from, do you think? Of getting back to business, having a decade of collaborative self-interests?
Yeah. I mean, I just think if you break away from the straitjacket of your past, so we tend to say here in New Zealand, for example, in the security realm, you hear from security conservatives, we can't abandon our traditional partners, emphasis on traditional. And that means the UK and the US. From someone like me, who's, a relatively recent arrival, my thought is, why not? Why not?
I think
I
David
mean,
Longer used to push that line. He was very firmly of a view that we are not of a hemisphere of the United States and the UK. We are quite simply one of Indo-Pacific.
right. Wouldn't it make more sense to have south to south, horizontal alliances
An independent
involving a
Pacific Island
country?
state ethos, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, because the French are present in the South Pacific, they could be a natural ally. I mean, I have said in public forums here in New Zealand that we should have a debate about our relationship with China on the one hand and the United States on the other. I mean, my biases are clear. I'm from the United States originally. I have Western liberal democratic values. I mean, that's where I prefer to be. However, to a newer generation of New Zealanders, and New Zealand's getting less white over time. It's much more Asian in characteristics than it was even 20 years ago when I arrived. Maybe we should have a national debate about where we want to orient ourselves and who we want to associate with in the first instance in the security as well as economic fields. I mean, who knows? Maybe, people in their teens and early 20s in New Zealand don't see the menace of China the way it's construed in the West. I mean, I don't know, and I happen to think there is some problems with China, but we are at the cusp of being able to negotiate with some degree of flexibility and independence that we haven't had before, our economic and security relationships, precisely because the United States has retreated from the world stage, precisely because countries are now looking to each other rather than the United States for their security and economic guarantees. And as a country that has a very good reputation worldwide, and I include the Australians as well in this, we have more freedom for maneuver on these two dimensions. And so, from our perspective, down here in the Antipodes, I would say we need to press the advantage because this post-pandemic era is our window of opportunity to make moves on the world stage.
On that point, Paul, thank you very much. And we'll look forward to being back this time next week. And to those who are watching this on either live or on demand, welcome. And we look forward to your presence again this time next week, where we'll no doubt be picking up another issue relating to geopolitics and regional securities and economic sustainabilities. Thank you, goodbye, and we'll see you next week.